2 Machabees, chapters 9 through 15 of the Bible, Douay-Rheims, 1899 American edition. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. At that time Antiochus returned with dishonor out of Persia, for he had entered into the city called Persepolis, and attempted to rob the temple, and to oppress the city. But the multitude running together to arms put them to flight. And so it fell out that Antiochus, being put to flight, returned with disgrace. Now when he was come about Ecbatana, he received the news of what had happened to Nicanor and Timotheus. And swelling with anger, he thought to revenge upon the Jews the injury done by them that had put him to flight. And therefore he commanded his chariot to be driven without stopping in his journey, the judgment of heaven urging him forward, because he had spoken so proudly that he would come to Jerusalem, and make it a common burying place of the Jews. But the Lord, the God of Israel, that seeth all things, struck him with an incurable and an invisible plague. For as soon as he had ended these words, a dreadful pain in his bowels came upon him, and bitter torments of the inner parts. And indeed very justly, seeing he had tormented the bowels of others with many and new torments, albeit he by no means ceased from his malice. Moreover, being filled with pride, breathing out fire in his rage against the Jews, and commanding the matter to be hastened, it happened, as he was going with violence, that he fell from the chariot, so that his limbs were much pained by a grievous bruising of the body. Thus he that seemed to himself to command even the waves of the sea, being proud above the condition of man, and to weigh the heights of the mountains in a balance, now being cast down to the ground, was carried in a litter, bearing witness to the manifest power of God in himself. So that worms swarmed out of the body of this man, and whilst he lived in sorrow and pain, his flesh fell off, and the filthiness of his smell was noisome to the army. And the man that thought a little before he could reach to the stars of heaven, no man could endure to carry for the intolerable stench. And by this means, being brought from his great pride, he began to come to the knowledge of himself, being admonished by the scourge of God, his pains increasing every moment. And when he himself could not now abide his own stench, he spoke thus: It is just to be subject to God, and that a mortal man should not equal himself to God. Then this wicked man prayed to the Lord, of whom he was not like to obtain mercy. And the city to which he was going in haste to lay it even with the ground, and to make it a common burying place, he now desireth to make free. And the Jews, whom he said he would not account worthy to be so much as buried, but would give them up to be devoured by the birds and wild beasts, and would utterly destroy them with their children, he now promiseth to make equal with the Athenians. The holy temple also, which before he had spoiled, he promiseth to adorn with goodly gifts, and to multiply the holy vessels, and to allow out of his revenues the charges pertaining to the sacrifices. Yea, also that he would become a Jew himself, and would go through every place of the earth, and declare the power of God. But his pains not ceasing, for the just judgment of God was come upon him, despairing of life, he wrote to the Jews in the manner of a supplication a letter in these words: To his very good subjects, the Jews, Antiochus, king and ruler, wisheth much health and welfare and happiness. If you and your children are well, and if all matters go with you to your mind, we give very great thanks. As for me, being infirm, but yet kindly remembering you, returning out of the places of Persia, and being taken with a grievous disease, I thought it necessary to take care for the common good, not distrusting my life, but having great hope to escape the sickness. But considering that my father also, at what time he led an army into the higher countries, appointed who should reign after him, to the end that if anything contrary to expectation should fall out, or any bad tidings should be brought, they that were in the countries, knowing to whom the whole government was left, might not be troubled. Moreover, considering that neighboring princes and borderers wait for opportunities and expect what shall be the event, I have appointed my son, Antiochus, king, whom I often recommended to many of you when I went into the higher provinces, and I have written to him what I have joined here below. I pray you, therefore, and request of you, that remembering favors both public and private, you will every man of you continue to be faithful to me and to my son. For I trust that he will behave with moderation and humanity, and following my intentions, will be gracious unto you. Thus the murderer and blasphemer, being grievously struck, as himself had treated others, died a miserable death in a strange country among the mountains. But Philip, that was brought up with him, carried away his body, and out of fear of the son of Antiochus, went into Egypt to Ptolemy Philometor. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10. But Machabees, and they that were with him by the protection of the Lord, recovered the temple and the city again. But he threw down the altars which the heathens had set up in the streets, as also the temples of the idols. And having purified the temple, they made another altar, and taking fire out of the fiery stones, they offered sacrifices after 2 years, and set forth incense and lamps, and the loaves of proposition. And when they had done these things, they besought the Lord, lying prostrate on the ground, that they might no more fall into such evils. But if they should at any time sin, that they might be chastised by him more gently, and not be delivered up to barbarians and blasphemous men. Now upon the same day that the temple had been polluted by the strangers, on the very same day it was cleansed again, to wit, on the 25th day of the month of Caslu. And they kept 8 days with joy, after the manner of the feast of the tabernacles, remembering that not long before they had kept the feast of the tabernacles when they were in the mountains, and in dens like wild beasts. Therefore they now carried boughs and green branches and palms, for him that had given them good success in cleansing his place. And they ordained by a common statute and decree that all the nation of the Jews should keep those days every year. And this was the end of Antiochus that was called the Illustrious. But now we will relate the acts of Eupator, the son of that wicked Antiochus, abridging the account of the evils that happened in the wars. For when he was come to the crown, he appointed over the affairs of his realm one Lysias, general of the army of Phoenicia and Syria. For Ptolemy, that was called Machabees, was determined to be strictly just to the Jews, and especially by reason of the wrong that had been done them, and to deal peaceably with them. But being accused for this to Eupator by his friends, and being oftentimes called traitor, because he had left Cyprus, which Philometor had committed to him, and coming over to Antiochus the Illustrious, had revolted also from him, he put an end to his life by poison. But Gorgias, who was governor of the holds, taking with him the strangers, often fought against the Jews. And the Jews that occupied the most commodious holds received those that were driven out of Jerusalem, and attempted to make war. Then they that were with Machabees, beseeching the Lord by prayers to be their helper, made a strong attack upon the strongholds of the Idumeans, and assaulting them with great force, won the holds, killed them that came in the way, and slew altogether no fewer than 20,000. And whereas some were fled into very strong towers, having all manner of provision to sustain a siege, Machabees left Simon and Joseph, and Zacchaeus, and them that were with them, in sufficient number to besiege them, and departed to those expeditions which urged more. Now they that were with Simon, being led with covetousness, were persuaded for the sake of money by some that were in the towers, and taking 70,000 didrachmas, let some of them escape. But when it was told Machabees what was done, he assembled the rulers of the people, and accused those men that they had sold their brethren for money, having let their adversaries escape. So he put these traitors to death, and forthwith took the 2 towers. And having good success in arms and all things he took in hand, he slew more than 20,000 in the 2 holds. But Timotheus, who before had been overcome by the Jews, having called together a multitude of foreign troops, and assembled horsemen out of Asia, came as though he would take Judea by force of arms. But Machabees and they that were with him, when he drew near, prayed to the Lord, sprinkling earth upon their heads, and girding their loins with haircloth, and lying prostrate at the foot of the altar, besought him to be merciful to them, and to be an enemy to their enemies, and an adversary to their adversaries, as the law saith. And so, after prayer, taking their arms, they went forth further from the city, and when they were come very near the enemies, they rested. But as soon as the sun was risen, both sides joined battle, the one part having with their valor the Lord for a surety of victory and success, but the other side making their rage their leader in battle. But when they were in the heat of the engagement, there appeared to the enemies from heaven 5 men upon horses, comely, with golden bridles, conducting the Jews, 2 of whom took Machabees between them, and covered him on every side with their arms, and kept him safe, but cast darts and fireballs against the enemy, so that they fell down, being both confounded with blindness, and filled with trouble. And there were slain 20,500, and 600 horsemen. But Timotheus fled into Gazara, a stronghold, where Chaereas was governor. Then Machabees and they that were with him cheerfully laid siege to the fortress 4 days. But they that were within, trusting to the strength of the place, blasphemed exceedingly, and cast forth abominable words. But when the 5th day appeared, 20 young men of them that were with Machabees, inflamed in their minds because of the blasphemy, approached manfully to the wall, and pushing forward with fierce courage, got up upon it. Moreover, others also getting up after them, went to set fire to the towers and the gates, and to burn the blasphemers alive. And having for 2 days together pillaged and sacked the fortress, they killed Timotheus, who was found hid in a certain place. They slew also his brother Chaereas and Apollophanes. And when this was done, they blessed the Lord with hymns and thanksgiving, who had done great things in Israel, and given them the victory. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11. A short time after this, Lysias, the king's lieutenant and cousin, and who had chief charge over all the affairs, being greatly displeased with what had happened, gathered together 80,000 men, and all the horsemen, and came against the Jews, thinking to take the city, and make it a habitation of the Gentiles, and to make a gain of the temple, as of the other temples of the Gentiles, and to set the high priesthood to sale every year, never considering the power of God, but puffed up in mind, and trusting in the multitude of his foot soldiers, and the thousands of his horsemen, and his 80 elephants. So he came into Judea, and approaching to Bethsura, which was in a narrow place, the space of 5 furlongs from Jerusalem, he laid siege to that fortress. But when Machabees and they that were with him understood that the strongholds were besieged, they and all the people besought the Lord with lamentations and tears, that he would send a good angel to save Israel. Then Machabees himself, first taking his arms, exhorted the rest to expose themselves together with him to the danger, and to succor their brethren. And when they were going forth together with a willing mind, there appeared at Jerusalem a horseman going before them in white clothing with golden armor, shaking a spear. Then they all together blessed the merciful Lord, and took great courage, being ready to break through not only men, but also the fiercest beasts and walls of iron. So they went on courageously, having a helper from heaven, and the Lord, who showed mercy to them. And rushing violently upon the enemy like lions, they slew of them 11,000 footmen, and 1,600 horsemen, and put all the rest to flight. Many of them, being wounded, escaped naked. Yea, and Lysias himself fled away shamefully, and escaped. And as he was a man of understanding, considering with himself the loss he had suffered, and perceiving that the Hebrews could not be overcome, because they relied upon the help of the Almighty God, he sent to them, and promised that he would agree to all things that are just, and that he would persuade the king to be their friend. Then Machabees consented to the request of Lysias, providing for the common good in all things. And whatsoever Machabees wrote to Lysias concerning the Jews, the king allowed of. For there were letters written to the Jews from Lysias to this effect: Lysias, to the people of the Jews, greeting. John and Absalom, who were sent from you, delivering your writings, requested that I would accomplish those things which were signified by them. Therefore, whatsoever things could be reported to the king, I have represented to him, and he hath granted as much as the matter permitted. If, therefore, you will keep yourselves loyal in affairs, hereafter also I will endeavor to be a means of your good. But as concerning other particulars, I have given orders by word both to these and to them that are sent by me, to commune with you. Fare ye well. In the year 148, the 24th day of the month of Dioscorus. But the king's letter contained these words: King Antiochus to Lysias his brother, greeting. Our Father, being translated amongst the gods, we are desirous that they that are in our realm should live quietly, and apply themselves diligently to their own concerns. And we have heard that the Jews would not consent to my father to turn to the rites of the Greeks, but that they would keep to their own manner of living, and therefore that they request us to allow them to live after their own laws. Wherefore, being desirous that this nation also should be at rest, we have ordained and decreed that the temple should be restored to them, and that they may live according to the custom of their ancestors. Thou shalt do well, therefore, to send to them, and grant them peace, that our pleasure being known, they may be of good comfort, and look to their own affairs. But the king's letter to the Jews was in this manner: King Antiochus to the Senate of the Jews, and to the rest of the Jews, greeting. If you are well, you are as we desire. We ourselves also are well. Menelaus came to us, saying that you desired to come down to your countrymen that are with us. We grant, therefore, a safe conduct to all that come and go, until the 30th day of the month of Xanthicus, that the Jews may use their own kind of meats, and their own laws as before, and that none of them any manner of ways be molested for things which have been done by ignorance. And we have sent also Menelaus to speak to you. Fare ye well. In the year 148, the 15th day of the month of Xanthicus. The Romans also sent them a letter to this effect: Quintus Mamaeus and Titus Menelaus, ambassadors of the Romans, to the people of the Jews, greeting. Whatsoever Lysias, the king's cousin, hath granted to you, we also have granted. But touching such things as he thought should be referred to the king, after you have diligently conferred among yourselves, send someone forthwith, that we may decree as it is convenient for you, for we are going to Antioch. And therefore make haste to write back, that we may know of what mind you are. Fare ye well. In the year 148, the 15th day of the month of Xanthicus. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. When these covenants were made, Lysias went to the king, and the Jews gave themselves to husbandry. But they that were behind, namely Timotheus and Apollonius, the son of Genneus, also Hieronymus and Demophan, and besides them Nicanor, the governor of Cyprus, would not suffer them to live in peace and to be quiet. The men of Joppa also were guilty of this kind of wickedness. They desired the Jews who dwelt among them to go with their wives and children into the boats which they had prepared, as though they had no enmity to them, which when they had consented to, according to the common decree of the city, suspecting nothing, because of the peace, when they were gone forth into the deep, they drowned no fewer than 200 of them. But as soon as Judas heard of this cruelty done to his countrymen, he commanded the men that were with him, and after having called upon God, the just judge, he came against those murderers of his brethren, and set the haven on fire in the night, burnt the boats, and slew with the sword them that escaped from the fire. And when he had done these things in this manner, he departed as if he would return again, and root out all the Joppites. But when he understood that the men of Jamniah also designed to do in like manner to the Jews that dwelt among them, he came upon the Jamnites also by night, and set the haven on fire with the ships, so that the light of the fire was seen at Jerusalem 240 furlongs off. And when they were now gone from thence 9 furlongs, and were marching towards Timotheus, 5,000 footmen and 500 horsemen of the Arabians set upon them. And after a hard fight, in which by the help of God they got the victory, the rest of the Arabians being overcome, besought Judas for peace, promising to give him pastures, and to assist him in other things. And Judas, thinking that they might be profitable indeed in many things, promised them peace, and after having joined hands, they departed to their tents. He also laid siege to a certain strong city, encompassed with bridges and walls, and inhabited by multitudes of different nations, the name of which is Casphin. But they that were within it, trusting in the strength of the walls and the provision of victuals, behaved in a more negligent manner, and provoked Judas with railing and blaspheming, and uttering such words as were not to be spoken. But Machabees, calling upon the great Lord of the world, who without any rams or engines of war threw down the walls of Jericho in the time of Joshua, fiercely assaulted the walls. And having taken the city by the will of the Lord, he made an unspeakable slaughter, so that a pool adjoining of 2 furlongs broad seemed to run with the blood of the slain. From thence they departed 750 furlongs, and came to Caraca, to the Jews that are called Tubianites. But as for Timotheus, they found him not in those places, for before he had dispatched anything, he went back, having left a very strong garrison in a certain hold. But Dositheus and Sosipater, who were captains with Machabees, slew them that were left by Timotheus in the hold, to the number of 10,000 men. And Machabees, having set in order about him 6,000 men, and divided them by bands, went forth against Timotheus, who had with him 120,000 footmen, and 2,500 horsemen. Now when Timotheus had knowledge of the coming of Judas, he sent the women and children and the other baggage before him into a fortress called Carnion, for it was impregnable and hard to come at by reason of the straitness of the places. But when the first band of Judas came in sight, the enemies were struck with fear by the presence of God, who seeth all things, and they were put to flight one from another, so that they were often thrown down by their own companions, and wounded with the strokes of their own swords. But Judas was vehemently earnest in punishing the profane, of whom he slew 30,000 men. And Timotheus himself fell into the hands of the band of Dositheus and Sosipater, and with many prayers he besought them to let him go with his life, because he had the parents and brethren of many of the Jews, who by his death might happen to be deceived. And when he had given his faith that he would restore them according to the agreement, they let him go without hurt for the saving of their brethren. Then Judas went away to Carnion, where he slew 25,000 persons. And after he had put to flight and destroyed these, he removed his army to Ephron, a strong city, wherein there dwelt a multitude of divers nations, and stout young men standing upon the walls made a vigorous resistance. And in this place there were many engines of war, and a provision of darts. But when they had invocated the Almighty, who with his power breaketh the strength of the enemies, they took the city, and slew 25,000 of them that were within. From thence they departed to Scythopolis, which lieth 600 furlongs from Jerusalem. But the Jews that were among the Scythopolitans, testifying that they were used kindly by them, and that even in the times of their adversity they had treated them with humanity, they gave them thanks, exhorting them to be still friendly to their nation, and so they came to Jerusalem, the feast of the weeks being at hand. And after Pentecost they marched against Gorgias, the governor of Idumea, and he came out with 3,000 footmen and 400 horsemen. And when they had joined battle, it happened that a few of the Jews were slain. But Dositheus, a horseman, one of Becanner's band, a valiant man, took hold of Gorgias, and when he would have taken him alive, a certain horseman of the Thracians came upon him, and cut off his shoulder, and so Gorgias escaped to Marisa. But when they that were with Esdrin had fought long and were weary, Judas called upon the Lord to be their helper and leader of the battle. Then, beginning in his own language and singing hymns with a loud voice, he put Gorgias's soldiers to flight. So Judas, having gathered together his army, came into the city of Odolam, and when the 7th day came, they purified themselves according to the custom, and kept the Sabbath in the place. And the day following Judas came with his company to take away the bodies of them that were slain, and to bury them with their kinsmen in the sepulchres of their fathers. And they found under the coats of the slain some of the donaries of the idols of Jamnia, which the law forbiddeth to the Jews, so that all plainly saw that for this cause they were slain. Then they all blessed the just judgment of the Lord, who had discovered the things that were hidden. And so, betaking themselves to prayers, they besought him that the sin which had been committed might be forgotten. But the most valiant Judas exhorted the people to keep themselves from sin, forasmuch as they saw before their eyes what had happened because of the sins of those that were slain. And making a gathering, he sent 12,000 drachms of silver to Jerusalem for sacrifice to be offered for the sins of the dead, thinking well and religiously concerning the resurrection. For if he had not hoped that they that were slain should rise again, it would have seemed superfluous and vain to pray for the dead. And because he considered that they who had fallen asleep with godliness had great grace laid up for them. It is therefore a holy and wholesome thought to pray for the dead, that they may be loosed from sins. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13. In the year 149, Judas understood that Antiochus Eupator was coming with a multitude against Judea, and with him Lysias the regent, who had charge over the affairs of the realm, having with him 110,000 footmen, 5,000 horsemen, 22 elephants, and 300 chariots armed with hooks. Menelaus also joined himself with them, and with great deceitfulness besought Antiochus, not for the welfare of his country, but in hopes that he should be appointed chief ruler. But the King of Kings stirred up the mind of Antiochus against the sinner, and upon Lysias suggesting that he was the cause of all the evils, he commanded, as the custom is with them, that he should be apprehended and put to death in the same place. Now there was in that place a tower 50 cubits high, having a heap of ashes on every side. This had a prospect steep down. From thence he commanded the sacrilegious wretch to be thrown down into the ashes, all men thrusting him forward unto death. And by such a law it happened that Menelaus, the transgressor of the law, was put to death, not having so much as burial in the earth. And indeed very justly, for insomuch as he had committed many sins against the altar of God, the fire and ashes of which were holy, he was condemned to die in ashes. But the king, with his mind full of rage, came on to show himself worse to the Jews than his father was, which when Judas understood, he commanded the people to call upon the Lord day and night, that as he had always done, so now also he would help them, because they were afraid to be deprived of the law, and of their country, and of the holy temple, and that he would not suffer the people that had of late taken breath for a little while to be again in subjection to blasphemous nations. So when they had all done this together, and had craved mercy of the Lord with weeping and fasting, lying prostrate on the ground for 3 days continually, Judas exhorted them to make themselves ready. But he, with the ancients, determined before the king should bring his army into Judea, and make himself master of the city, to go out, and to commit the event of the thing to the judgment of the Lord. So, committing all to God, the Creator of the world, and having exhorted his people to fight manfully, and to stand up even to death for the laws, the temple, the city, their country, and citizens, he placed his army about Modin. And having given his company for a watchword, the victory of God, with most valiant chosen young men, he set upon the king's quarter by night, and slew 4,000 men in the camp, and the greatest of the elephants with them that had been upon him. And having filled the camp of the enemies with exceeding great fear and tumult, they went off with good success. Now this was done at the break of day by the protection and help of the Lord. But the king, having taken a taste of the hardiness of the Jews, attempted to take the strong places by policy. And he marched with his army to Bethsura, which was a stronghold of the Jews. But he was repulsed, he failed, he lost his men. Now Judas sent necessaries to them that were within, but Rhodocus, one of the Jews' army, disclosed the secrets to the enemies. So he was sought out and taken up, and put in prison. Again the king treated with them that were in Bethsura, gave his right hand, took theirs, and went away. He fought with Judas, and was overcome. And when he understood that Philip, who had been left over the affairs, had rebelled at Antioch, he was in a consternation of mind, and entreating the Jews, and yielding to them, he swore to all things that seemed reasonable, and being reconciled, offered sacrifices, honored the temple, and left gifts. He embraced Machabees, and made him governor and prince from Ptolemy unto the Gerenians. But when he was come to Ptolemy, the men of that city were much displeased with the conditions of the peace, being angry for fear they should break the covenant. Then Lysias went up to the judgment seat, and set forth the reason, and appeased the people, and returned to Antioch. And thus matters went with regard to the king's coming and his return. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. But after the space of 3 years, Judas and they that were with him understood that Demetrius, the son of Seleucus, was come up with a great power, and a navy by the haven of Tripolis, to places proper for his purpose, and had made himself master of the countries against Antiochus and his general Lysias. Now one Alcimus, who had been chief priest, but had wilfully defiled himself in the time of mingling with the heathens, seeing that there was no safety for him, nor access to the altar, came to King Demetrius in the year 150, presenting unto him a crown of gold and a palm, and besides these some boughs which seemed to belong to the temple. And that day indeed he held his peace. But having gotten a convenient time to further his madness, being called to council by Demetrius, and asked what the Jews relied upon, and what were their counsels, he answered thereunto, They among the Jews that are called Asidians, of whom Judas Maccabeus is captain, nourish wars, and raise seditions, and will not suffer the realm to be in peace. For I also, being deprived of my ancestors' glory, I mean of the high priesthood, am now come hither, principally indeed out of fidelity to the king's interests, but in the next place also to provide for the good of my countrymen. For all our nation suffereth much from the evil proceedings of those men. Wherefore, O king, seeing thou knowest all these things, take care, I beseech thee, both of the country and of our nation, according to thy humanity, which is known to all men. For as long as Judas liveth, it is not possible that the state should be quiet. Now when this man had spoken to this effect, the rest also of the king's friends, who were enemies of Judas, incensed Demetrius against him. And forthwith he sent Nicanor, the commander over the elephants, governor into Judea, giving him in charge to take Judas himself, and disperse all them that were with him, and to make Alcimus the high priest of the great temple. Then the Gentiles who had fled out of Judea from Judas came to Nicanor by flocks, thinking the miseries and calamities of the Jews to be the welfare of their affairs. Now when the Jews heard of Nicanor's coming, and that the nations were assembled against them, they cast earth upon their heads, and made supplication to him who chose his people to keep them forever, and who protected his portion by evident signs. Then, at the commandment of their captain, they forthwith removed from the place where they were, and went to the town of Deseu to meet them. Now Simon, the brother of Judas, had joined the battle with Nicanor, but was frightened with the sudden coming of the adversaries. Nevertheless, Nicanor, hearing of the valor of Judas's companions, and the greatness of courage with which they fought for their country, was afraid to try the matter by the sword. Wherefore he sent Posidonius, and Theodosius, and Matthias before, to present and receive the right hands. And when there had been a consultation thereupon, and the captain had acquainted the multitude with it, they were all of one mind to consent to covenants. So they appointed a day upon which they might commune together by themselves. And seats were brought out, and set for each one. But Judas ordered men to be ready in convenient places, lest some mischief might be suddenly practiced by the enemies. So they made an agreeable conference, and Nicanor abode in Jerusalem, and did no wrong, but sent away the flocks of the multitudes that had been gathered together. And Judas was always dear to him from the heart, and he was well affected to the man. And he desired him to marry a wife, and to have children. So he married. He lived quietly, and they lived in common. But Alcimus, seeing the love they had one to another, and the covenants, came to Demetrius, and told him that Nicanor assented to the foreign interest, for that he meant to make Judas, who was a traitor to the kingdom, his successor. Then the king, being in a rage, and provoked with this man's wicked accusations, wrote to Nicanor, signifying that he was greatly displeased with the covenant of friendship, and that he commanded him nevertheless to send Machabees prisoner in all haste to Antioch. When this was known, Nicanor was in a consternation, and took it grievously that he should make void the articles that were agreed upon, having received no injury from the man. But because he could not oppose the king, he watched an opportunity to comply with the orders. But when Machabees perceived that Nicanor was more stern to him, and that when they met together as usual he behaved himself in a rough manner, and was sensible that this rough behavior came not of good, he gathered together a few of his men, and hid himself from Nicanor. But he, finding himself notably prevented by the man, came to the great and holy temple, and commanded the priests that were offering the accustomed sacrifices to deliver him the man. And when they swore unto him that they knew not where the man was whom he sought, he stretched out his hand to the temple, and swore, saying, Unless you deliver Judas prisoner to me, I will lay this temple of God even with the ground, and will beat down the altar, and I will dedicate this temple to Bacchus. And when he had spoken thus, he departed. But the priests, stretching forth their hands to heaven, called upon him that was ever the defender of their nation, saying in this manner, Thou, O Lord of all things, who wantest nothing, wast pleased that the temple of thy habitation should be amongst us. Therefore now, O Lord, the Holy of all holies, keep this house forever undefiled, which was lately cleansed. Now Razias, one of the ancients of Jerusalem, was accused to Nicanor, a man that was a lover of the city, and of good report, who for his affection was called the Father of the Jews. This man for a long time had held fast his purpose of keeping himself pure in the Jews' religion, and was ready to expose his body and life that he might persevere therein. So Nicanor, being willing to declare the hatred that he bore the Jews, sent 500 soldiers to take him, for he thought by ensnaring him to hurt the Jews very much. Now as the multitude sought to rush into his house, and to break open the door and to set fire to it, when he was ready to be taken, he struck himself with his sword, choosing to die nobly rather than to fall into the hands of the wicked and to suffer abuses unbecoming his noble birth. But whereas through haste he missed of giving himself a sure wound, and the crowd was breaking into the doors, he ran boldly to the wall, and manfully threw himself down to the crowd. But they, quickly making room for his fall, he came upon the midst of the neck. And as he had yet breath in him, being inflamed in mind, he arose, and while his blood ran down with a great stream, and he was grievously wounded, he ran through the crowd. And standing upon a steep rock, when he was now almost without blood, grasping his bowels with both hands, he cast them upon the throng, calling upon the Lord of life and spirit to restore these to him again. And so he departed this life. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. But when Nicanor understood that Judas was in the places of Samaria, he purposed to set upon him with all violence on the Sabbath day. And when the Jews that were constrained to follow him said, Do not act so fiercely and barbarously, but give honor to the day that is sanctified, and reverence him that beholdeth all things. That unhappy man asked, If there were a mighty one in heaven that had commanded the Sabbath day to be kept? And when they answered, There is the living Lord himself in heaven, the mighty one that commanded the seventh day to be kept. Then he said, And I am mighty upon the earth, and I command to take arms, and to do the king's business. Nevertheless he prevailed not to accomplish his design. So Nicanor, being puffed up with exceeding great pride, thought to set up a public monument of his victory over Judas. But Machabees ever trusted with all hope that God would help them, and he exhorted his people not to fear the coming of the nations, but to remember the help they had before received from heaven, and now to hope for victory from the Almighty. And speaking to them out of the law and the prophets, and withal putting them in mind of the battles they had fought before, he made them more cheerful. Then, after he had encouraged them, he showed withal the falsehood of the Gentiles, and their breach of oaths. So he armed every one of them not with defense of shield and spear, but with very good speeches and exhortations, and told them a dream worthy to be believed, whereby he rejoiced them all. Now the vision was in this manner. Onias, who had been high priest, a good and virtuous man, modest in his looks, gentle in his manners, and graceful in his speech, and who from a child was exercised in virtues, holding up his hands, prayed for all the people of the Jews. After this there appeared also another man, admirable for age and glory, and environed with great beauty and majesty. Then Onias answering said, This is a lover of his brethren, and of the people of Israel. This is he that prayeth much for the people, and for all the holy city, Jeremiah the prophet of God. Whereupon Jeremiah stretched forth his right hand, and gave to Judas a sword of gold, saying, Take this holy sword, a gift from God, wherewith thou shalt overthrow the adversaries of my people Israel. Thus being exhorted with the words of Judas, which were very good and proper to stir up the courage and strengthen the hearts of the young men, they resolved to fight, and to set upon them manfully, that valor might decide the matter, because the holy city and the temple were in danger. For their concern was less for their wives and children, and for their brethren and kinsfolks, but their greatest and principal fear was for the holiness of the temple. And they also that were in the city had no little concern for them that were to be engaged in battle. And now when all expected what judgment would be given, and the enemies were at hand, and the army was set in array, the beasts and the horsemen ranged in convenient places, Machabees, considering the coming of the multitude, and the divers preparations of armor, and the fierceness of the beasts, stretching out his hands to heaven, called upon the Lord that worketh wonders, who giveth victory to them that are worthy, not according to the power of their arms, but according as it seemeth good to him. And in his prayer he said after this manner, Thou, O Lord, who didst send thy angel in the time of Ezekias, king of Judah, and didst kill 185,000 of the army of Sennacherib, send now also, O Lord of heaven, thy good angel before us, for the fear and dread of the greatness of thy arm, that they may be afraid who come with blasphemy against thy holy people. And thus he concluded his prayer. But Nicanor and they that were with him came forward with trumpets and songs, but Judas and they that were with him encountered them, calling upon God by prayers, so fighting with their hands, but praying to the Lord with their hearts, they slew no less than 35,000, being greatly cheered with the presence of God. And when the battle was over, and they were returning with joy, they understood that Nicanor was slain in his armor. Then, making a shout and a great noise, they blessed the Almighty Lord in their own language. And Judas, who was altogether ready in body and mind to die for his countrymen, commanded that Nicanor's head and his hand with the shoulder should be cut off and carried to Jerusalem. And when he was come thither, having called together his countrymen and the priests to the altar, he sent also for them that were in the castle, and showing them the head of Nicanor and the wicked hand which he had stretched out with proud boasts against the holy house of the Almighty God, he commanded also that the tongue of the wicked Nicanor should be cut out and given by pieces to birds, and the hand of the furious man to be hanged up over against the temple. Then all blessed the Lord of heaven, saying, Blessed be he that hath kept his own place undefiled. And he hung up Nicanor's head in the top of the castle, that it might be an evident and manifest sign of the help of God. And they all ordained by a common decree by no means to let this day pass without solemnity, but to celebrate the 13th day of the month of Adar, called in the Syrian language the day before Mardochus' day. So these things being done with relation to Nicanor, and from that time the city being possessed by the Hebrews, I also will here make an end of my narration, which if I have done well, and as it becometh the history, it is what I desired, but if not so perfectly, it must be pardoned me. For as it is hurtful to drink always wine, or always water, but pleasant to use sometimes the one and sometimes the other, so if the speech be always nicely framed, it will not be grateful to the readers. But here it shall be ended. End of chapter 15.